In this video we're going to be looking at the three different physical states of matter: the solid state, the liquid state, and the gaseous state. To understand these three states and the properties that substances have when they're in each of these states, we need to look at the particles, that is, the atoms, ions or molecules that substances are made of, and how these particles behave. We can use particle models to illustrate the three states. In the solid state, the particles of our substance are packed close together and arranged in a regular, ordered fashion. The particles are held firmly together so they can't move around, but in a solid the particles do vibrate, and the hotter the solid gets, the more they vibrate. Because the particles can't move around, solids have a fixed shape, which means they have their own shape rather than taking up the shape of whatever container they're in. You might think this is not true for fine powders like sand, but every sand grain is solid. They have their own shapes, and these do not change even though the grains of sand might get moved around. Because the particles are so close together in a solid, we can't compress a solid into a smaller volume by applying pressure to it. Liquids, unlike solids, take up the shape of the container they are placed in. This indicates that the particles can not only vibrate, but can also move around, which is why liquids can flow. The particles in liquids are still close together, so, like solids, liquids can't be compressed into a smaller volume by applying pressure. Gases also take up the shape of their container, occupying all the volume in the container. The particles in a gas move freely and rapidly, and there is lots of space between the particles, which means that when we apply pressure to a gas, its volume gets smaller. Substances change their state between solid, liquid and gas as a result of heating or cooling. These changes happen because of the amount of energy the particles in the substance have. The more we heat a substance, the more energy the particles have. Starting with the solid, the particles don't have much energy and just vibrate a little. As we give them more energy, eventually the particles gain enough energy to overcome the forces holding them in place, and the particles start to be able to move around, although they remain close together because there are still forces between the particles holding them one to another. We call this process melting. If we keep on heating and giving the particles more energy, eventually they reach the point where they have enough energy to escape from one another and are able to go anywhere within the container as a gas. We call this process boiling. Alternatively, we could start with a gas and cool it down, taking heat energy away from the particles. As they cool, they'll reach the point where they can no longer escape the attractions between the particles, and the particles will start to clump together in droplets, becoming a liquid. We call this process condensing. As we cool the particles in the liquid further, eventually they have so little energy that they just remain in place, vibrating as a solid, and don't move anymore. We call this process freezing. A very small number of substances turn directly from a solid into a gas when heated. The most common of these is iodine. The process of turning directly from a solid to a gas without melting and becoming a liquid is called sublimation. It is important to realise that while these changes of state take place, there are no chemical changes or reactions happening. Water, ice and steam are all H2O, with each molecule being made from 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. Ice is just water in the solid state, and steam is just water in the gaseous state. The only difference between ice, water and steam is how much energy the water molecules have in each case.